Welcome to Leadership Conversations brought to you by Lead Like Jesus. I'm Karen Conley and so glad to have you joining us today. I want to welcome our guest, Tim Olson. Tim, welcome to the Zoomcast.
Thank you, Karen. I'm really looking forward to it. Appreciate your invitation to be here.
Well, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago, we began talking about this particular Zoomcast. And as I started to look at your book and all the wealth of experience that you bring, I know that our audience is in for a really helpful and meaningful Zoomcast. If people are not familiar, Tim has authored a book called The Legacy of Absence. And I really want to read the subtitle because it really defines the problem and the solutions that hopefully we're going to be able to talk about and offer. It's The Legacy of Absence, Resolving the Wounds from Uninvolved Fathers in Individuals, Family, and Society. And man, Tim, you bring your perspective and experience, not just as an author, but you have been an educator, a principal, you have been a business owner, a pastor. And as I began to think about this topic, you've really been able to see it from many sectors of culture. But you wrote the book, I understand, as a business book initially. Why did you look at this topic as a business perspective?
Well, it's interesting that I have been able to bring experiences from all of those occupations into the book. I really feel that that's been an advantage to have so many different backgrounds.
Absolutely.
Because it gives such a varied perspective. As far as the business is concerned, most of my clients were business owners or businessmen. In fact, they ended up becoming family business owners. And as I worked with them, what I recognized was that the problems were not so much about business, they were more and more about the relationship that the leaders, the managers, and even the employees had with their fathers or with their own children over the years. And when we worked with those and resolved those, most of the business issues tended to go away. They solved themselves. And other business writers will say the same thing. If you deal with a family, you'll resolve the business issues. Now, I tried to take it one step farther and not just talk about the family, but specifically about father issues, because that's more of the root of the whole thing. In fact, there's a quote that I use on the back of my book, and it's the first sentence in my introduction. And it says that we can trace all the problems in society back to the root issues of fathers not being involved in the lives of their children. That's a powerful statement. And when you think about it, all the issues, think about any problems that you have in your life. They don't seem to be connected to our fathers at all. But if you trace it back all the way to the root, we find out that that really is a true thing. And so often when I was working with businesses, with business owners and family businesses, we would start to focus on other business issues specifically, maybe about some employee issues. And I started to think, oh boy, I'm in over my head with this client. That's not what I thought I was going to work with. And then it was as if I was directed back, oh yes, the real purpose of our conversations is about the family relationships and about the father relationships. And once I reminded the client of that, and we got back on track, they agreed, yes, we need to talk about that. And suddenly it was like, that's why I'm involved here. That's why we were connected. And we talked about those things, and those business issues that kept cropping up tended to take care of themselves. It was really quite amazing. So in my book, I was encouraged by my editor and by other people to focus on a broader audience than business. because it is such a compelling topic that impacts all of us, every one of us. In fact, every one of us has a father. Believe it or not, we do. And so the issues that are involved with fathers affects every one of us. And they suggested maybe if I want to focus on business, that could be the second book. My wife says, no way, I want you back. Writing a book takes too much time.
Well,
And so we'll see.
Well, Tim, let me ask, because as I think about this topic, in some ways it can be a little debilitating. You know, if I think about somebody in our audience who is a successful leader, and there are times in our lives where, you know, our coping mechanism with an unhealthy parent-child relationship is to go, you know, prove ourselves and to find our identity in our work and those kinds of things, and to kind of bury some of the problems of the past and maybe not deal with them. And so to you know, I'm thinking about someone listening to the first few minutes of this and thinking about, you know, gosh, if I'm a dad or even a mom, and we can talk about the influence and how women walk into this dynamic as well. What hope would you give? You've worked with all of these family businesses. You've been a life coach. You've walked into these situations, and you've been able to give hope. And so we want to dig in. We've got to define the problem. We've got to make sure people understand why this is a subject that you can't just gloss over. But for that person who's listening who thinks, oh my goodness, I don't want to go there. Like, that's the hardest place to go, is to think back to some of the places that don't feel healthy with the people that we love. What encouragement would you give somebody right now that thinks, okay, I can continue in this, but it's uncomfortable. Why should I?
Well, for one thing, it's never too late. We can always bring about change. Part of the issue is being able to recognize that there is a way out. There are answers. One of the very most simple ways to say it is that if there's a problem because of absent fathers or uninvolved fathers, the solution is presence, to be involved. And so really it's the ability to say, all right, we're going to choose to be more involved, more intentional. How can we do that? But recognizing the problem in the first place is really the issue. And so I've called it the legacy of absence. And people often say, well, why the legacy? And the reality is that we are all really a composite of our parents. And that means their personalities, their personality traits, their character qualities, their skills, their abilities, their behaviors. So many of these things have become a part of who we are. And our spouse, it's the same thing. That comes into the picture. And so here in our marriage, we've got these two generational issues that are affecting us. But so often all we see is, this is who we are right now. We're in this problem. We've got these issues in our lives. How in the world? We're just stuck. But we have to recognize as a starting point that we are really this composite. And it's not just this generation or our parents, but it's a generation before them and before them. And all of this is part of who we are. The more I looked into this and wrote this book, the more I realized how generations are a significant part. When I have worked with men in halfway houses, coming out of recovery centers and out of prison and so on, they very often are like victims. Woe is me. This is who I am. This is who my dad was. This is who my kids are. That's just what the lot life has dealt us, or the hand life has dealt us. And so this is what we are. But we have to recognize that that's the first thing, is to identify what's going on, or that we have a problem, and then be able to say, if I intentionally address the issue, I have a choice to change it or to keep it the same. maybe this would be a good point to mention a practical story from myself. Back when my oldest son was, let's say, 10 to maybe 13 years of age, this is like ancient history. That's probably 65 years ago. It's hard to remember all the details. I was a band director at the time in school, public school. And so I played instruments. My kids all played instruments. And so one weekend, my parents were up from Chicago visiting. We lived in Minnesota. I grew up in Chicago. They were up to visit us. And so I said to my son, why don't we play a duet for them? I think that'd be kind of fun. Well, kids at that age, they can either be really into it and say, yeah, I love to play for people, or they can be like so many of them, I don't want to do this. I don't want to play for grandma and grandpa. And that's what my son was doing at the time. And just dragging his feet. And finally, as we were setting up, I just kind of had enough of it. And I elbowed him and said, why don't you just go to your room then? Let's forget this. Which he did, and he was glad to. But I turned around and I faced my folks and feeling kind of embarrassed. I mean, I was working with 200, 250 kids a day and really doing very well at it. And that was my thing, was to work with these kids. And so here was a case, an example of not being able to do it well. And I was embarrassed in front of my folks. And surprisingly, they defended me and rationalized for me. And they said, you know, Tim, you've got to realize or remember that your dad had a temper, has a temper. My dad was sitting right there, and he agreed. And his father was even worse with this issue and this temper. And his father was worse yet. And of course, that was partially alcohol driven. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't at all with my dad. He never drank in his life. Yet I realized they drew this picture of generational influence all the way down for me. And at that time, when they described that to me, I was remembering the verse from the Bible that says that the sins of the fathers will be visited to the third and fourth generations, or be visited to the sons for the third and fourth generations. And that was me. In their description, this was essentially the third generation. And it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, that I had always thought about that verse having to do with the major sins like murder and adultery and so on. And this wasn't that. But in this case, I realized this wasn't something that would be from God. It wasn't a good thing, this anger issue. And so that's why it was such a practical verse right at that time. My folks didn't say this. This just came to me. And so I said to my folks, just a minute, I've got to do something. I went into my son's bedroom and I said, Dave, I got to ask your forgiveness for two things. That kind of caught his attention. And I had a conversation with him that I had never had with my folks, with my dad. It was never intimate. My dad was what would be described as a passive dad, a very good man, present, active, but was not really involved in my life personally in terms of maturity, identity, self-esteem issues, things like that. We never had those kind of discussions. That was something I chose to do differently with my kids. So we had this discussion, and I said, I described what just went on. Well, first of all, I said, what happened out there was not your fault. It was mine. Would you please forgive me? Fortunately, he said yes. Then I described our discussion about these generations to him. And I said, what really makes me sad is that I see that you are now picking up that same thing. And it's not, that's not a generational thing or a legacy thing that is part of like genetics. We learn this by observation. Mm-hmm. All those generations, my ancestors had observed their fathers and never talked about the issues. They just learned from them. And so I did the same thing, and now my son was doing the same thing. And I said, I'm really sad about that. Would you please forgive me for passing this on to you? And once again, he said yes. And then I said, the Bible tells us one more thing that's very, very practical, and that is we can stop this. We can change it. Would you be willing to work on this with me, with your mom, and with God to try and change what's happened in our lives? And he agreed again, said yes. And I have to tell you that today, that son is 53. He has 4 daughters. 3 of them are married. One of them is engaged. The 4th is engaged to be married. And he has 4 grandchildren. So I have 4 great-grandchildren. Hard to believe for me. And yet, I don't see this anger. Sure, the 2 of us, from time to time, that anger might raise its ugly head a little bit, but we know how to deal with it. We know the source of it, and we can manage it. And so hopefully a story like that even will bring some hope to people wondering how they can practically make changes for the different issues. That's just one issue. There are so many issues that we deal with on a daily basis. But by approaching them and being willing to go beneath the surface and talk about the details, we can make changes.
Tim, I love your example. I think people often relate and can, see themselves either as you in that story, as your son, or as your father, that we kind of each listen to a story like that and find our place. What would you say to that business leader out there that maybe he is the adult son? He is his own man. He has his own family, but he didn't grow up in your home where you had this epiphany, and he doesn't have maybe that type of relationship with his own grown children, and he doesn't have that healthy relationship with his own father. What would you say would be the first steps for somebody who either thinks, wow, I wish I had known that when my son was 10 and now he's grown and we have this surface level relationship? What would you say would be a first step for a man in that situation?
Well, once again, it's awareness of the situation, awareness that it is possible to make changes, and that we are not trapped, and that we have a vision of what it could be like. And that's one of the things I always say with my clients is, what would it look like if it was ideal? So to the boss, we might say what would an ideal relationship look like between you and your son, or between you and your father, or your employee, or your wife, or your husband? What would it be like if it was ideal? And that gives us a starting place to be able to say, now, how are we going to get there? What might be the steps? What would it take? And have them come up with the answers. That's one thing about coaching, is that you try never to give people answers. They have to, if they come up with them, they're going to be far more willing to follow through and do them. And so to be able to do that, give them a picture, help them decide what their picture is, ideally, and then design steps to get there is basically the way. And again, by giving them examples like I just did, that's what we call being a mentor. This is what I did, this is what worked for me. However, we are not the same, and our solutions are not the same. So we have to find out what works specifically for you. But at least my story might trigger some ideas and some thoughts. And so I use a lot of stories and a lot of examples. And then they start to say, well, what would work for me is to find another person that I can use for accountability, and just to talk very vulnerably with each other about the problems, and then to decide what to do from there. And there are a lot of great books that help us come up with solutions. And so I know them. I've got books behind me, in my own library here, that I can immediately turn to and say, this book speaks to the problem you just described. And why don't you read it?
Well, and I certainly want to give our listeners resources. I would love to do a part two, because I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and really there's so much more that we can offer our listeners. Maybe as we bring this particular Zoom cast to a close, we can maybe circle back to that business element of this. As you have said, in reference to you being a life coach, you being a business owner, um, if someone is out there right now, that's in a leadership position, can you give some examples if they're trying to kind of diagnose, I've got issues in my business, it's a stressful season, all those kinds of things, but I'm not really sure that this has any relationship to my personal life. What are the types of things that you have seen that can maybe be kind of a checklist for somebody in that position to go, okay, maybe that is an issue, that I haven't maybe identified the source back to some of my own personal way that I cope or the way I see things. What have you seen in the business world as some examples that maybe the business owner didn't recognize as this being the core issue that might be helpful for someone in this evaluative process?
Well, once again, it tends to not be about business for the business owner. To be able to paint the picture that what's happening for them is the same for everybody in any walk of life. And then, so in my book, the first chapter is a business story about a client that I have, and the fact that his business, he had 3 businesses and they all failed. And yet they were successful for a time, but then they failed. And same with several marriages. And so my first question to him after he described all that was, what was your relationship like with your father when you were growing up? And he was almost went ballistic with the thought that had anything to do with it. That's not a business question. And I said, well, just humor me and tell me what you think. And so he thought for a while, and then he started to cry. And pretty soon his crying turned into shoulder shaking heaves. And apparently his relationship with his father did have something to do with it. And he cried through boxes and boxes of Kleenex as we spent months talking about this. And when he realized that his relationship with his father really was at the core, he was sabotaging his businesses because he could never do anything good enough to please his father. Mm-hmm. And as people read things like that, they start to make the connection, whether they're business leaders or not. They see that and they make the connection. And then once we're able to do that, we're able to talk about how to resolve that relationship as adults, because every time he gets to talk with his father, it just falls apart. They end up yelling at each other and nothing is gained. So we try to somehow back up from that and find very practical ways that he could approach his father to try to change that. And if I get into some of those specifics, that would take us a while yet longer to describe them. But does that help?
That's great. And I want to encourage everyone as we wrap up this particular Zoom cast. The Legacy of Absence is Tim's book. Tim, where is the best place if people want to buy your book or reach out to you and know more about the life coaching that you offer? What's the best place for them to do that?
Well, the book is available at Amazon. However, you can get the ebook there, but the print version, they will tell you it's unavailable, and that's actually because of the virus, the coronavirus right now, is making Amazon say that their priority is to essential products. And so my book is unavailable, and if you order it from them, it'll tell you it's 1 to 3 months delivery. So instead, go to my website, timolsonauthor.com. And that's Olson is O-L-S-O-N, not E-N. And so it's timolsonauthor.com. And on the second tab for the book, there'll be a place there, links there, where you can order the paperback through BookBaby, it's called. And so once you go to my website, you'll be able to find out how to order the paperback there.
Great. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to a part 2 where we can provide some more tools for people that that resonate with this, maybe being something that they can walk into and read and learn from you and your experience. So we'll look forward to a part 2. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please check out Tim Olson's book and that resource, and also go to leadlikejesus.com, where you'll also find terrific resources available for you. And until next time, have a great day.